Everybody, and on to page 23. Now, you might have been a little bit confused at the beginning because George MacDonald says a word that you may never have heard before called a refrigerium. And you should be thinking about refrigerators because refrigerators are themselves sources of refreshment, and refrigerium simply means refreshment in Latin. What was this idea? Well, it was this pious idea that people, after somebody had died, would go and they would kind of have like a picnic next to the gravesite of that person, and that kind of community would itself bring refreshment. We have something similar to this today in Dia de los Muertos, celebrated by most Mexican cultures, um, where they bring food and other kinds of offerings, candles and pictures in a sort of altar. Um, which is not inappropriate, right? It's if taken from a perspective that it's not a food offering to these people, but rather sort of a remembrance of them being a community, then it's a proper Catholic understanding of the service. Um, Now let's move forward. What is refrigerium in regards to how George MacDonald is describing it? Well, it's a refreshment as in a time away for the damned from hell. And so, what are their options? Well, some of them can go and play tricks on people on Earth. Some of them can go and haunt old houses that they liked. Some of them can go and see if people are reading their books in libraries, and others can go and try and check in on their children. So those are kinds of the general things that the souls in hell can go do on their time away, their vacation from being in hell. Is this a real thing? Does this actually happen? I don't know. I'm not dead, and I haven't died yet. Um, Parts of the tradition say that it is, but mostly Catholics hold that you can't really leave hell after you're in hell. Yeah, nothing too complicated there. Now we're going to move on to the complicated part, these valleys that they're talking about. So what is being described in the bottom half of the page? Well, we could say, or the way that I've characterized it is this: it's absolute realities that are being described in subjective ways. Well, Mr. de Villiers, what does that mean? So, absolute realities, we've talked about. Absolute realities are things that exist for all of time and all of space. They're absolute things. God is love. Squares can't be round. Those kinds of things. In a similar way, hell is an absolute reality, and so is heaven. But one's subjective experience of it can change the way that one perceives it. And that's at least how George MacDonald is describing it here. Is this completely in line with Catholic teaching? It is not, as George MacDonald remarks on, right? We don't believe that people can leave hell. We don't believe that anybody can leave that kind of an absolute state. But the way that George is describing it is that it is an absolute state just with subjective experiences. For example, you can say that God is perfectly just, which may be the case, and it is the case. Or you can say God is merciful, which is also true. You may say those two things at different times depending on your experience of God at the moment. Does that change the absolute reality of who God is, that he is both perfectly just and perfectly merciful? No, it doesn't change those realities. But it does mean that you have a different subjective experience of it. So what does that mean? Well, hell is an absolute place. But if you leave hell and you choose to stay in heaven, then you'll realize that that was only purgatory or the valley of the shadow of death, wherein we also read the psalmist say that I shall fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. So there's no real harm that somebody could experience in hell, so long as they're attuned to God. That also being said, we wouldn't consider the place that Lewis's character is in now to be heaven, right? George MacDonald also says that that could be considered the valley of the shadow of life. That sure, all things can be heaven once heaven works itself retroactively, as we see in page 24. But that doesn't that doesn't mean that it's hell proper, that it's perfect communion with God. That's only for whenever you're in the mountains. But this place that they're in now is certainly an important aspect of reality. Um, and yeah, I want to focus on this more on the next lecture. This confusing thing about hell working retroactively and heaven working retroactively. But I just want you to get that in your head that if you're in hell now, then you'll always be in hell. And if you're in heaven now, then your entire life was, in fact, heaven.